She didn't speak French. That's what everyone assumed. That's what he counted on. He was standing 6 feet away from her at his own engagement party, leaning toward his best friend with a champagne flute tilted at a careless angle. And he said it in French because the room was loud and the string quartet was playing something bright, and the woman he was engaged to had never once, in 14 months of dating, given him a single reason to believe she understood a syllable of it. Elle bien, mais franchement, j'aurais pu faire mieux. Elle n'est pas vraiment le niveau. Tu sais? Mais elle est tranquille. Elle ne pose pas de problems. She's fine, but honestly, I could have done better. She doesn't really have the level, you know? But she's quiet. She doesn't cause problems. His friend laughed the way friends laugh when they're uncomfortable and don't want to show it. Someone nearby refilled a glass. The quartet moved into a new piece. 300 candles threw warm light across 200 guests in their finest clothes, and somewhere near the bar a woman in a gold dress was telling a story that made everyone around her dissolve into laughter, and the evening had the particular gilded momentum of a party that had already decided it was going to be remembered as perfect. Mia Solis stood 12 inches behind her fiancé, holding a small plate of canapés she no longer had any interest in eating, and felt 14 months of a life she had been building quietly and carefully and in good faith come apart in the space of a single breath. She set the plate down on the nearest surface. Not hard, not with any drama, with the particular quiet of a woman who has just understood something she cannot ununderstand and is already, in the very same second, deciding what to do about it. She smoothed the front of her dress. She took one breath. She turned and walked toward the elevator at a pace that nobody in the room would have read as anything other than a woman who needed a moment of air. Nobody followed. Why would they? Mia Solis never caused problems. Daniel had said so himself, not 2 minutes before, in a language he had no idea she spoke. She removed the ring in the elevator, held it on her palm for exactly the length of one floor's descent, feeling the weight of it, which was not inconsiderable, 3 carats, chosen by his mother, sized by his assistant, presented in a restaurant he'd booked because the lighting was good for photographs rather than because it was a place that meant anything to either of them. She put it in the small interior pocket of her clutch, the one meant for a card or a key, and stepped out of the elevator into the lobby and through the lobby into the night air, and by the time her car arrived she had already made the first of 3 phone calls. What happened in the 6 months that followed destroyed everything Daniel Ashworth thought he had, and rebuilt something considerably better from the pieces he'd never bothered to look at closely enough to value. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, stay with this one. It only gets more satisfying from here. Go ahead and like this video, drop your city in the comments, I read every single one, and subscribe to the channel because we tell stories about women who win quietly, and this is exactly that kind of story. Let's begin. Mia Solis had studied French at the University of Lyon on a full academic scholarship she had earned at 21 through a combination of top percentile grades. A personal statement her undergraduate advisor had described as the best he'd read in 11 years, and a linguistic aptitude that her professors had noted, in their recommendation letters, with the particular enthusiasm reserved for the genuinely rare. She had spent 3 years in France, lived in Lyon and then in Paris, become fluent in the gradual, total, unremarkable way that only happens when a language stops being something you translate in your head and starts being something you simply think in. She had returned home at 25 with a postgraduate degree in international business strategy, near native French fluency, functional Italian, and a professional vocabulary in 3 languages that she deployed, in her subsequent career, with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else she did. The scholarship had not come easily. Her mother had worked evenings and weekends for 3 years of Mia's childhood to save the money that kept the option of a serious education alive, and Mia had understood this with the particular, bone-deep understanding that comes when a child is old enough to see what a parent is sacrificing without being old enough to stop them. She had studied the way people study when they understand, at a foundational level, that the opportunity in front of them was built by someone else's labor and cannot be wasted. She had been the first in her family to leave the country. She had been the first to earn a graduate degree. She had come home from Lyon fluent in 2 foreign languages and shaped, in ways she was still discovering years later, by 3 years of living inside a culture that had required her to think, speak, and exist in terms that were not her own, which had given her a particular, practiced fluency in understanding things from positions other than her own that turned out to be among the most professionally and personally useful capacities she possessed. She had never mentioned any of this to Daniel. This was not deception exactly. The subject had never arisen the way it might have if Daniel had been, in practice, the kind of man who asked detailed questions about her life before him. He had the social fluency to seem interested. He asked enough questions to give the impression of genuine curiosity, remembered enough specific details to appear attentive, laughed at the right moments and listened, apparently at the right moments too. He was, by every measurable social metric, a man who paid attention. What he paid attention to, Mia came to understand over 14 months, was the surface. What she looked like on his arm at a dinner, how she handled herself at a client event, whether she made the evenings he needed her for go smoothly. He paid very close attention to those things. He paid considerably less attention to the interior of her life, the things she thought about, the work she had done, the person she had been in the years before they met, the languages she carried quietly inside her like a second and third set of rooms in a house he'd only ever walked through the front hallway of. She noticed this over the months and told herself what people tell themselves in the early to middle stages of a relationship with someone charming and apparently devoted, that depth would come with time, that the performance phase was simply the phase, and that the real intimacy was ahead of them rather than perpetually deferred. She had told herself this with decreasing conviction across the final 4 months of the engagement, as the wedding machinery had gathered momentum and the space for honest assessment had narrowed with it, and she had not yet allowed herself to name what was replacing the conviction because naming it would have required acting on it, and acting on it required a kind of courage that is difficult to summon when you are already inside the machinery of a large, expensive, publicly committed future. Daniel stopped the machinery himself. In French, 6 feet away from her. In a room full of 200 people he had invited to celebrate a decision whose actual terms, it turned out, he had never quite made in the way she'd believed he had. She arrived home that evening at 9:52. She knew the time because she looked at the clock when she came in, not from any particular reason, but because she had a habit, inherited from her father, of noting the precise time of significant moments. It was a useful habit and a slightly melancholy one, because it meant she knew the exact time at which most of her important memories had occurred, including the one she was standing inside right now. She went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, drank half of it, and sat down at the table with a legal pad and a pen. She had always done this with large decisions, written them out plainly on paper in her own handwriting, so that the version of the situation she was dealing with was the clear and honest version rather than the managed one her instinct for composure had a way of producing when she kept things in her head. It was not a habit she had ever described to Daniel, because the occasions on which it had occurred to her to describe it were the same occasions on which she had understood that he would not have found it particularly interesting, and that understanding had begun, over time, to shape the whole architecture of what she shared with him. She wrote for 20 minutes. Not quickly, not with any particular emotion, with the same patient, systematic attention she brought to the analysis work she did professionally. She wrote what she had heard, what she understood it to mean, what it was consistent with that she had already observed but not fully examined, and what she now understood about the 14 months that had preceded this evening. At the end of 20 minutes, she read what she had written, drew a single horizontal line under it, and wrote 3 sentences beneath the line. He meant every word. He has been meaning them for some time. The only thing that has changed tonight is that I know it. She turned the pad face down, picked up her phone, and made the 3 calls. The first call was to her attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Claire Baxter who had handled Mia's business contracts for 4 years and who received the information that the engagement was over and the wedding would not be happening with a calmness that managed to convey, without saying it explicitly, that she had harbored concerns about the arrangement since its inception. "I'll draft the formal disengagement correspondence first thing tomorrow," Claire said. "Any joint financial exposure I need to know about?" "None. I kept everything separate throughout." He found it mildly insulting at the time. He'll find it considerably less insulting now than he did then. A brief pause, the particular pause of a woman exercising professional restraint. "Are you all right, Mia?" "Yes," Mia said. She was slightly surprised to find she meant it. "Good. I'll have the draft to you by noon tomorrow. Get some sleep." The second call was to her mother, Elena Solis, who was 63, a retired high school Spanish teacher, and the person who had first put a French textbook in Mia's hands at age 12 because she believed, with the total conviction of a woman who had spent her own life limited by what she didn't know, that languages were the one thing nobody could take from a person once they had them. Elena listened to the whole account without interrupting, which was notable because she was not, in general, a woman who found listening without interrupting easy. "He said this in French," she said, when Mia had finished. "Yes. At his own engagement party. Yes. 6 feet away from you. Approximately." A long pause. Then her mother said, with a kind of focused, offended clarity, "Mia, that man never deserved you. I have thought this from the beginning and I have kept it to myself because I was asked to, but I am telling you now because apparently we are finally in a moment where it can be said plainly. He never once looked at you the way a person looks at someone they actually see." Mia found that this was the sentence, in a night full of significant sentences, that came closest to undoing her composure. She kept her voice level. "Come Sunday for dinner? We'll say nothing more about it. I'll make the lamb," her mother said, which was Elena Solis's highest register expression of love, reserved exclusively for situations that warranted it. The third call was the one that would change everything. For the past 4 months, Mia had been in preliminary conversations with Park Capital, a mid-sized venture capital firm seeking a head of international business development, a role that required exactly the combination of cross-border market fluency, multi-language capability, and strategic analysis she had been quietly underusing for several years, first in a corporate procurement role she'd outgrown and then, increasingly, in the slow contraction of her professional ambitions that had accompanied the engagement. She had put the conversations on hold when the wedding planning had accelerated with the private, barely examined logic of a woman who has absorbed, without quite deciding to, the assumption that her partner's career trajectory is the primary one and hers is the one that makes room. The assumption had never been stated by anyone. It had simply taken up residence, the way assumptions do when nobody examines them carefully enough to throw them out. She called the firm's managing partner at 10:21 that evening, reached his voicemail, and left a message that said she was available to continue the conversation at his earliest convenience. He called back the next morning, before her first cup of coffee had finished brewing. His name was Julian Park. She did not tell Daniel she had been offered the role. When she called him 3 days later to arrange the return of his ring and the resolution of the practical matters the ending of an engagement tends to generate. The call was brief and precisely civil, the kind of exchange that conveys, through its very efficiency, that the person on one end of it has moved somewhere the person on the other end does not have access to, and that no amount of conversation will change this. "Mia," he said at the end of it, with the particular weight of a man who has been conducting, privately, the same kind of inventory she had conducted at her kitchen table 3 nights earlier and has arrived at results he does not entirely like. "Will you at least tell me what happened? What I did?" She considered this. "You said, in French, at our engagement party, that I was fine but you could have done better. That I didn't have the level, but I was quiet and I didn't cause problems." She let a brief silence sit where his response might have gone. "I assume you weren't aware that I understood you. I studied in Lyon for 3 years, Daniel. I have near native fluency. I simply never mentioned it, because the occasions on which it might have come up were also the occasions on which I noticed you weren't particularly curious about that kind of thing." The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation. "Mia, I'm not calling to have this conversation," she said, gently but with complete finality. "I'm calling to arrange the logistics. I wish you well. I genuinely mean that, but I think we both understand now that this was the right decision." She ended the call, poured her coffee, and opened her laptop to prepare for her meeting with Julian Park. Julian Park was 39. The son of Korean immigrants who had built a small manufacturing business in the industrial outskirts of the city and sent their only child to a state university on the understanding, articulated clearly from his earliest years, that education was not a luxury but the most reliable form of insurance a person could hold. He had funded his own MBA, built Park Capital from a single partnership into a firm with $200 million under management, and done all of it with a specific, principled unwillingness to be the kind of person in a room who made others feel smaller than they were, because he had spent enough years being the person in a room who was made to feel smaller than he was to understand exactly what that cost and to have decided, somewhere in his early 30s, that he would not participate in it. He was also, as Mia registered at their first meeting, A breakfast that had been scheduled for 45 minutes and ran 2 hours without either of them noticing. One of the most genuinely attentive listeners she had ever sat across a table from. He asked about Lion. Not because the role required it, but because she had mentioned, in passing, that her French was French rather than textbook French, and he had wanted to know how that had happened. He asked about the procurement work, not for its relevance to the position but because he found the specific mechanics of how she had approached it genuinely interesting. He asked what she would do differently with the international development portfolio if she could start from a blank page, and then listened to the answer with the focused, unperforming attention of someone who was going to use the information rather than simply collect it. Mia drove home from that breakfast in a state she could not immediately name and eventually identified as the experience of having been actually seen by someone she had just met, which was a sufficiently unfamiliar experience that it had temporarily disrupted her ability to categorize it. She took the role. She started 3 weeks later. The first 6 months at Park Capital were the most intellectually demanding of her professional life and the most personally energizing, which she had not known those two things could be simultaneously true in quite this way. She was in Paris for a deal in her 2nd month, in Seoul in her 3rd, in Sao Paulo in her 4th, conducting negotiations in French and Italian and English on behalf of a firm whose international ambitions had previously been constrained by the absence of anyone with both the language capability and the strategic instinct to pursue them properly. She was, in the plainest terms, exactly the right person for the job. She had always been exactly the right person for the job. She had spent the previous 4 years being quietly, pleasantly, convincingly redirected away from understanding this about herself. Julian noticed all of it. Not in a way that was showy or that called attention to itself, but in the ongoing, practical, consequential way of a person who pays attention to what the people around him are actually doing rather than what he has decided they are doing. He noticed when she made a call on a deal that everyone else in the room had initially disagreed with and turned out to be precisely right. He noticed when she restructured a negotiation approach on the Paris deal that brought a counterparty back to the table who had been ready to walk away. He told her, when these things happened directly and specifically, without the vague generalized praise that feels like applause for the room rather than recognition for the person. She began, gradually and carefully, to trust it. The trusting was gradual because she had learned, across 14 months of a relationship with someone who had the performance of attention down perfectly and the substance of it barely at all, to distinguish between these two things with a precision that had become second nature by the time she was no longer in the relationship. Julian's attention consistently passed the test, which was the test of whether it remained present when there was nothing to gain from its presence. Whether he was as interested on a slow afternoon with no deal at stake as he was when a performance was called for. He was. She tested this many times, and arrived at the same result each time. She was not looking for anything beyond a professional relationship. In the early months. She was not, in the early months, looking for anything at all, having understood from her kitchen table inventory that what she needed more than anything was a clear and sufficient period of simply being herself, without the ongoing low-level management of someone else's perception of her, which she had not fully registered was something she had been doing throughout the engagement until she stopped doing it and felt the relief of the stopping settle over her like setting down something she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it had weight. But Julian was patient without being strategic about it, and honest without being blunt about it, and present in the way that makes a person's presence gradually necessary, and sometime around the 7th month of working together she acknowledged to herself, sitting in a taxi in Paris after a dinner that had been ostensibly professional and had felt, by its end, like something rather more than that this was a thing she was going to have to think about. She thought about it. In Lyon, that same week, on a free afternoon between meetings, walking streets she had walked many times in the 3 years she had lived there, listening to the city the way you listen to a place you love. Not for information, but for the specific pleasure of its sounds in your ears. She called Julian from the presqu'île, the afternoon light bronze on the stone buildings around her. Listening to the city the way you listen to a place you love. Not for information but for the specific pleasure of its sounds in your ears. The market stalls near the river were wrapping up for the evening, vendors folding their canopies with the easy practiced motion of people who have done the same thing at the same hour for years, and the smell of bread and wet stone and something floral she had never been able to identify in 3 years of trying came off the streets in the particular late afternoon combination that she had carried with her, unexport but intact, through every year since she had left. "I'm in Lyon," she said when Julian picked up. "How is it?" he asked without any qualifier, Not how's the deal or how's the trip, simply, how is it? It's everything I forgot about and everything I remembered at the same time. She paused. I spent 3 years here. I haven't been back since I left. What made you leave? Nobody had ever asked her that. In 14 months of an engagement, through hundreds of hours of conversation, nobody had ever thought to ask what had pulled her away from a city she had spent 3 years making into a home. My mother, she said. She was alone, and I was the only one, and I missed her, and eventually missing her outweighed everything else. And do you regret coming back? She looked at the river. A couple walked past her, hand in hand, speaking to each other in the easy shorthand of people who have been speaking the same language together for years and no longer need to be careful with it. No, she said. I regret some of what I did with the time after I came back. But not coming back. A pause. I kept my French, though. All of it. I was very deliberate about that. Some people, when they leave a language behind, let it fade. I wasn't willing to. It felt like leaving part of myself behind in a way I hadn't agreed to. Julian was quiet for a moment. She had the impression he was writing something down, which he often did during their conversations, a habit she had initially found surprising and had come to understand was his version of paying attention, capturing things so he could return to them rather than letting them pass through. Tell me about the 3 years, he said. Not the professional parts. The other parts. She stood on the bridge and told him. The market she had gone to every Saturday morning for fresh bread and cheese she couldn't afford. The cafe where she had spent every Sunday afternoon for the first year. Reading in French because immersion required total commitment and she had understood from the beginning that total commitment was the only way this was going to work. The friend she had made in her second year, a Senegalese graduate student named Aminata who had taught her that fluency was not the goal. Understanding was the goal, and fluency was simply what happened when you stopped being afraid of being wrong. The specific quality of the light in October, which was different from any light she had seen anywhere else, lower and more golden and somehow both melancholy and galvanizing in a way she had tried to describe to people at home and had always failed at. Julian listened to all of it. He asked questions in the right places. He said nothing for the right stretches. By the time she finished it was nearly dark and her feet were cold from standing on the bridge for 45 minutes and she felt, in a way she had not expected to feel standing alone in a foreign city, entirely not alone. Thank you for telling me, he said when she finished. Thank you for asking, she said. She walked back to her hotel in the dark, past lit windows and the sound of conversation and cooking from open doors, and thought, this is what it feels like, when someone actually wants to know. She had been telling herself, since the engagement ended, that she did not need anyone to want to know. That self-sufficiency was the lesson and that she had learned it and that what she was building now, the role, the travel, the career that finally matched the size of what she was actually capable of, was sufficient and satisfying and everything she needed. She still believed all of that. She also believed, walking through Lion in the dark, that these things and wanting to be known were not mutually exclusive, and that she had been conflating them because it was easier than admitting that what Daniel had failed to give her was something she actually, genuinely wanted. To be seen clearly, completely, and with the kind of interest that does not perform itself and does not wane when there is nothing to be gained from it. Julian Park had been offering exactly that from the first breakfast, without making anything of it, without expecting anything in return for it, simply as the natural operating mode of a person who found other people genuinely interesting and had never once needed to fake it. She called her mother from the hotel room that night. Maman, she said in French, which she only did when the mood called for it. I think I'm in trouble. Her mother laughed. What kind? The good kind, Mia said. The kind where the person actually asks about Lion. Her mother laughed again, longer this time. Then you're not in trouble at all, she said. You're just finally paying attention to the right things. She told him about Daniel 6 weeks later, over a dinner in the city that had by then quietly ceased to be entirely professional and had not yet been formally acknowledged as anything else. She told the whole of it, Lion, the scholarship, the 3 years, the fluency she had never mentioned because the occasions for mentioning it had also been the occasions for noticing it wasn't going to be received with genuine interest. She told him about the party, the 6 feet of distance, the 23 words she had heard perfectly in a room full of competing noise because ears trained in a language for 3 years do not miss it when it is spoken nearby. She told him about the kitchen table and the legal pad and the 3 phone calls. Julian was quiet for a moment when she finished. Outside the restaurant window, the evening moved around them in the easy, unhurried way of a city that had been a city long enough not to be in any particular hurry about anything. He said this in French, Julian said. At his own engagement party, 6 feet from you, counting on you not to understand it. Yes. And you understood every word. Every word. Julian set down his glass with deliberate care. I'm going to say something that I'd normally consider professionally inappropriate and have decided I don't particularly care about anymore. Say it. His loss is the most fortunate thing that has ever happened to this firm, and I find it very difficult to feel sorry for him, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Mia laughed, a real laugh, the full kind, the kind she had forgotten she produced quite differently when it was real versus when it was constructed, and looked across the table at him and thought, there it is, there has been the whole of it, sitting here the entire time, and it took a man 6 feet away from me in a language he didn't know I spoke to finally make me stand up and find it. Thank you, she said. For what? For asking about Lion. She paused. For asking generally. You asked from the beginning. You wanted to know the actual answers. That turned out to matter more than I'd known it would. Daniel Ashworth spent the first month after the engagement ended in the comfortable assumption that she would reconsider. He had, in his experience, never made a significant error in judgment that had not eventually turned out to be recoverable, because he was someone for whom things generally recovered, not because he worked particularly hard to recover them, but because the architecture of his life, the money, the social ease, the fundamental assumption of his own centrality, had a way of self-correcting errors before they became permanent. He assumed this error would correct the same way. He sent messages she answered briefly and without warmth. He called twice. She picked up once, spoke with the brisk civil efficiency of someone handling a practical matter, and ended the call the moment the practical matters were resolved. He told his friends and his family in the first weeks that it was a misunderstanding, that things were complicated, that he was giving her space. His friends nodded and said the right things and privately held the opinions they had held for 14 months but had been too polite to voice, which were various and not flattering to him. His sister called him in the 3rd week and said, with the particular directness of a sibling who has waited long enough, Daniel, what did you do? Nothing, he said, with the immediate, reflexive quality of a man who means not that he did nothing but that he cannot yet see what he did. Then why is she gone? He did not have an answer that satisfied either of them. In the 5th week, he asked Marcus to dinner. Marcus came, ordered the fish, and waited with the practiced patience of a man who had been friends with Daniel for 20 years, and had long since learned that the conversations worth having with him required a runway. I keep thinking about the party, Daniel said. Which part? Daniel looked at his glass. The French. Marcus set down his fork. She understood it, Daniel said. Daniel. Marcus spoke carefully, the way you speak to someone standing at the edge of an understanding that is going to hurt them. I didn't know she spoke French. I've known you for 20 years and I didn't know your fiancé spoke French, because I had never once, in 14 months, heard you mention a single thing about her education or her languages or anything she had done before she met you. I think we all assumed that you knew, that you had asked. Daniel said nothing. Had you? Marcus asked. Asked. The silence that answered him was the longest of the evening. He learned about Julian Park in the 10th month. He learned about the role, the travel, the deals, the scope of it, the full, specific, concrete picture of what Mia Solis was doing in the world when no one was redirecting her energy toward making someone else's life run more smoothly. He did not learn these things from her. He learned them the way people learn things in professional networks, indirectly, through the ordinary movement of information between people who know people who know people, and he sat with each new piece of information and felt it settle into the growing inventory of what he had failed to see. He had described her, at his own engagement party, as someone who didn't cause problems. He had meant it, at the time, as a kind of praise, the particular praise of a man who values smooth surfaces and interprets their maintenance as a personal quality of the person doing the maintaining rather than as labor being performed on his behalf. He understood now, sitting with the 10th month's inventory in front of him, what that labor had actually cost her. and what his assumption of it had actually been. He sent a message to Mia that month, worded carefully, asking if they might speak. She replied 3 days later, and her reply was brief and entirely, unassailably kind. No hostility, no residual heat, no door ajar. She wished him well, and she meant it. He could tell she meant it because there was nothing in the message that required anything from him in return, and kindness that requires nothing from the recipient is the only kind that cannot be negotiated with. He wrote back, "I know. I'm sorry. I should have paid better attention." She did not reply. There was nothing that needed replying to. He learned about Julian Park through a mutual contact in the 10th month. Learned the context, Park Capital, the international development role, the scope of what she was doing there, through a combination of the kind of information that circulates naturally in professional networks and the particular, self-inflicted research of a man who has begun to understand, too late, the full dimensions of something he did not value until after he lost it. He found, in the course of this understanding, that Mia Solis had been doing exactly the kind of work, at the level of exactly the kind of organization, that her entire professional background had been building toward, and that she had not been doing it for the 14 months they were together, during which time he had described her, to his friends and his family and his business partners and, at his own engagement party, to his best friend, as someone who kept herself busy. He sat with this for a long time. It did not feel good to sit with. But it was the kind of discomfort that a person either learns from or spends years running from, and Daniel Ashworth, who was not without self-awareness when sufficiently confronted with the need for it, chose to sit with it properly rather than run, which was perhaps the most honest thing he did in the entire span of the story. He did not contact her again. He understood, by the 10th month, that there was nothing to contact her for. Mia and Julian were married on a Saturday in October, 15 months after she had walked out of her engagement party carrying a ring in her clutch and a clarity in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. The ceremony was small, 44 people, a restaurant that had been important to both of them for reasons that had nothing to do with lighting or photographs, a celebrant who had known Julian for 8 years and who conducted the ceremony with the particular warmth of someone who understood exactly what they were witnessing and found it genuinely moving. Julian's vows included, among other things, 2 sentences in French. They were grammatically exact and emotionally precise, which meant he had written them himself and had them checked rather than simply translated, because he understood, having listened carefully across 15 months, the difference between those 2 things. The first sentence told her that he had known, from the breakfast in the first week, that he was in the presence of someone extraordinary, and that he had spent the subsequent months trying to be worthy of that rather than simply trying to impress it. The second sentence told her that he intended to keep asking questions about Lion, and about everything else for the rest of his life, because she had turned out to be considerably more interesting than most of what he had spent his previous 39 years paying attention to. She laughed through the second sentence. He had been counting on that. Her mother, in the second row, wept in a way that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with the specific, vindicating relief of a woman watching her daughter receive, at last, exactly what she had always deserved and slightly more than she had ever allowed herself to ask for. There is a particular kind of invisibility that comes not from being ignored but from being seen only partially, from being with someone who looks at you often and understands you seldom, who pays close attention to the surface and mistakes thoroughness for depth. It is a subtle thing, this kind of invisibility. It does not announce itself. It settles over a person gradually, the way light changes in a room over the course of an afternoon, until one day you realize that the version of yourself you have been presenting has grown so careful, so managed, so oriented toward what will be well received, that you have begun to lose track of the original, the thing underneath the performance, the person who studied in Lion and spent 3 years building fluency in a language because she loved the sound of it and wanted it to be hers. Mia had not lost track of herself, not entirely. But she had allowed the track to grow narrow in 14 months, and the narrowing had been so gradual and so reasonably explained at each step that she had not noticed what was happening until 23 words of French gave her a reason to stop and look properly. He had counted on her not understanding him. What he did not know, what he had never taken the time to discover, was that understanding was precisely what she had been doing all along. Not just in French. In every room they had ever shared together. Reading him, reading the situation, reading the gap between what was presented and what was true, with the same patient, exacting attention she brought to everything in her life that she actually cared about. She had understood him perfectly. She had been waiting, without quite knowing she was waiting, for a moment clear enough to act on what she understood. He gave her that moment himself, in someone else's language, 6 feet away from her, at a party thrown in honor of a future he had never quite fully committed to, with a woman he had never quite fully seen. She walked out. She made 3 phone calls. She went to Paris and Seoul and Sao Paulo and spoke French and Italian and English to rooms full of people who were trying to understand each other across the distances that languages bridge and ambitions and histories create. She married a man who asked about Lion and listened to the answers. And Daniel Ashworth learned, in the months that followed, the specific and irreversible cost of assuming that a quiet woman is a woman who is not paying attention. She was always paying attention. He had simply never paid enough to know it. And that, in the end, was not her failure. It was his. The only thing she had ever done wrong was spend 14 months being so composed about absorbing it that neither of them had been forced to see it clearly until a careless sentence in a foreign language made the truth impossible to miss. She did not regret the composure. It had built the discipline and the patience that had made everything that followed possible. But she had made, somewhere in those 14 months, the quiet decision to revise it going forward. To be composed because it served her, not because it served someone else's comfort. To be quiet when quiet was her choice, not because someone's assumption required it. In the language Daniel Ashworth had counted on her not knowing, there is a phrase, prendre la mesure de quelque chose, to take the full measure of something, to understand it completely in all its dimensions, not just the parts that are convenient to see. She had always taken the full measure of things. He had simply taken for granted that she hadn't. If someone's low opinion of you has ever quietly become the ceiling you were building your life under, this story is proof that the ceiling was never yours. It was only ever theirs, and the moment they showed you exactly what they thought of you was the moment they handed you the key to the door out of it. Like this video, if it stayed with you. Drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest. Was it the party? Was it the kitchen table? Was it Lion? I read every single one. And if stories about women who finally let themselves take up all the space they were always entitled to are the kind you want more of, subscribe to the channel. We'll have another one waiting. Take care of yourselves. Until next time.